Always true.
We ask the questions.
What is needed in the world?
Američki je investitor i multimilioner, koji ujedno slovi za jednog od najoštrijih kritičara ruskog predsjednika Vladimira Putina. Nakon smrti njegovog advokata Sergeja Magnickog u ruskom pritvoru, samostalno je lobirao i progurao zakon kojim se oštro sankcionišu autoritarni lideri zbog kršenja ljudskih prava. Tim pravnim aktom, poznatim kao Magnitski zakon, do sada su sankcionisani deseci pojedinaca, od ruskih oligarha do tjelohranitelja Mohameda bin Salmana koji stoje iza ubistva Džemala Hašogdžija. O krizi između Rusije i Ukrajine, te zašto smatra da bi Vladimira Putina najteže pogodilo uvođenje sankcija njegovoj porodici i bliskim saradnicima, za Al Jazeera govori Bill Browder.
Now, Mr. Browder, hello and welcome to Al Jazeera, and thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. Now, first of all, as you watch Russia amass more than 120,000 troops along Ukraine's borders, what do you think President Vladimir Putin's ultimate objectives are? Is he just bluffing? Is he playing the blame game? Or is he seriously determined to invade the largest country in Europe?
Well, I think that he's definitely playing a very risky game of chicken. You know, he's driving his car straight towards the Western car, and he's trying to see who's going to swerve first. It would be absolutely disastrous for him in so many different levels if he were to do a serious invasion of Ukraine. Ukrainians would fight back, and there would be lots of bloodshed on both sides. And the West would impose crippling sanctions on Putin personally and on Russian companies more generally. So from his perspective, that's a pretty big cost. But he also gets a benefit from all of this posturing, which is that every day there's a new world leader coming to Moscow to kiss the ring of Vladimir Putin. And if you were to compare these moments to back when at the G20 summit in Brisbane, where nobody would even sit with him at the table, he's accomplished a lot already in terms of becoming the only important person that everybody wants to talk to.
Is he simply looking for respect?
I wouldn't say he's looking for respect as much as he's looking to define himself for the Russian people as a very tough and important leader of Russia. He wants the Russian people to say, wow, we're so happy Vladimir Putin is our guy, and he can stand up to all of these evil Westerners that they've been led to believe are surrounding Russia and threatening Russia's security.
Right, but do you think he still has territorial aspirations towards at least the eastern parts of Ukraine? Would this be in the interest of Russia?
Well, it's interesting. If you read Putin's writings, he says all sorts of things about territorial aspirations, and he makes comments to say that Ukraine isn't a real country and so on and so forth. But Putin, in my mind, is a con man, and con men, their statements and their sentences and their words don't mean anything. In my mind, he's trying to manipulate somebody, and that somebody in this case, when he's talking about territorial aspirations, are the Russian people. In my opinion, Putin really doesn't care about Russia at all. He cares about staying in power for himself, and he cares about keeping the money that he's stolen over the last 20 years.
But bearing in mind that he will be 70 years old next year, do you think he's also thinking about his legacy, how he wants to be remembered in the future?
I don't think that he's even considering his legacy for a second. I think all he's thinking about is, how am I going to stay in power this week and next week? And what do I have to do the week after that so that my power base continues to be strong? Vladimir Putin is most concerned about his own survival, and he won't survive if he's no longer the president of Russia. He'll probably end up going to jail, perhaps even worse things than that. And so from his perspective, it's just everything is a short-term tactical game to stay in power.
Right. Now let's move on to how the EU and NATO have reacted. In your opinion, has this crisis only reinvigorated and revitalized NATO as a Western military alliance? We remember that only recently French President Emmanuel Macron said NATO was brain dead.
Well, in a certain sense, so if you look at what Vladimir Putin's kind of geopolitical objectives are, he doesn't like big blocks of countries that can stand up to him for whatever he's doing. He likes to deal with individual small countries that he can bully, blackmail, threaten, etc. And so from that perspective, he hates NATO because it's a large group of countries. He hates the EU because it's a large group of countries, and he hates the United States because it's a very large country. And so from his perspective, the real success in this whole thing is to try to split up opinions in these different groups. And he's very successfully done that in the EU. There are countries in the EU like Hungary and Austria that are extremely pro-Putin, that don't want to be tough on him, versus the Netherlands or Sweden, for example. And he's also been able to divide opinion in NATO. NATO is really it's a fictitious organization in the sense that everybody is a member and they're supposed to all go to defend each other, but one never knows if that's going to be the case until there's a situation where they all have to go and defend one another. And so Putin has very successfully divided opinion in NATO. The Germans won't even let British military equipment pass over Germany on its way to assist the Ukrainians. And so
that was exactly my next question. How do you make sense of Germany's balancing act, walking the tightrope between NATO and Russia? I mean, is Germany to that extent dependent upon Russian energy that it's willing to sacrifice its relations with its Western allies?
Germany has really gotten themselves into a big mess. They are very dependent on Russian gas. 40% of the German gas consumption comes from Russia. And over the last 10 years, they could have become less dependent on Russian gas, but instead they decided to build a pipeline to have even more Russian gas. And so Germany, for whatever reason, has totally compromised itself. And I think that the German government is really in a very awkward position vis-a-vis countries like the US, UK, Canada, because they're arguing very strongly behind closed doors to appease Putin.
Right. Apart from military deterrence, economic sanctions are another option. You've been the creator of the Magnitsky Act. Could you explain to our viewers why you argue that Putin's threat of invading Ukraine can be stopped with one simple policy by applying the Magnitsky Act to him and to his oligarch trustees?
So Putin, when he came to power, he didn't come to the presidency of Russia because he was interested in public service to serve the Russian people. And by the way, nobody in government in Russia goes to the government to serve the people. They go to government to make money. It's the most kleptocratic regime in the world. And over a 22-year period, Vladimir Putin has made a lot of money. I would guess at least $200 billion that he's stolen from the Russian people. And if you add on the money that's held by people around him, it probably comes close to $1 trillion. And that is what they care about. They care about that money more than anything else out there. And so when we look at what are our policy options to stop them from invading Ukraine, we've got to come up with something that really touches their personal interests, Putin's personal interests and that of those around him. And so when we start talking about sanctions, it's a great word, but sanctions can mean anything. For example, you could sanction 100 random names in the telephone directory, and that's not going to stop Putin from invading. But if you go after his personal money, because that's something he values more than human life, I believe that would stop him from invading. And the way you go about that is to go after the oligarchs who hold their money in the West. Putin doesn't hold any money in his own name. He holds it with people he trusts. I call them oligarch trustees. And so my prescription for this problem, and one that would be completely bloodless, there will be no loss of life, is to pick out the 50 wealthiest oligarchs in Russia who look after Putin's money and we know who those people are, and apply the Magnitsky Act to those people in the West on a coordinated basis. And if one were to do that, or just threaten that, properly threaten that, there would be no war in Ukraine for sure.
Right, but is the West ready for such an act?
Well, if you had asked me this question a month ago, I would have said absolutely not. The West has no appetite for this. But I think as policymakers look at what the options are and what the outcomes are, this is something that people have now started to rally around. And so if you look at statements made by President Biden about 10 days ago, he said that he wouldn't hesitate to sanction Putin and the people around him. And then following that statement, the British Foreign Secretary Liz Truss made a similar statement saying that oligarchs were not off limits and were open to be sanctioned. And what's interesting about that is if you look at Putin's behavior, he had been hiding during this whole Ukraine standoff. He hadn't come out and said anything publicly. And it was only after Liz Truss made these very provocative statements about sanctioning oligarchs that he then became animated and started speaking publicly about what they were going to do in Ukraine, what they weren't, and so on and so forth.
Now, when we talk about sanctioning Russian oligarchs close to the Kremlin, why do you argue that there are legitimate targets in the UK, in London? I came across a figure of 450 billion pounds that has been invested by Russian oligarchs since 1994. I mean, how correct are such estimates?
Well, what's interesting is that when the Soviet Union fell apart and the oligarchs sort of emerged from the ashes, the place that they wanted to keep their money safe was the UK.
Why not Switzerland?
But they do have money in Switzerland. That's not a place where they don't have money. But the UK became the offshore center for Russia. So in history, Hong Kong was to China as the UK has been to Russia. And one of the reasons they like the UK is that the UK, their property rights are respected, that there's a rule of law here, and none of that exists in Russia. So they would steal the money in Russia and then they'd keep it safe in the UK. Oh, and then the thing they loved most about the UK is that nobody would ask any questions. And the more money that came in from Russia, the less questions were asked. And so this created a real problem. So when the Russians were busy assassinating their enemies on UK soil, the British government never had a very tough response because the underlying theme was we don't want to mess up kill the golden goose, stop this flow of money. Now we're in a much more elevated and dangerous situation where we risk world war effectively if Russia were to invade Ukraine. And in this situation, this whole history can actually be turned hugely to the UK's advantage because this permissive attitude brought all this money here. You mentioned a figure. I don't know if that's the correct figure or whether it's larger or smaller, but it's a lot of money. And because they have all that money here, the UK has what I would describe as outsized leverage in this whole policy discussion. If the UK decided to sanction Russian oligarchs, all these oligarchs have a lot of money and other assets here, and that money is exposed and could be seized.
Right, but Transparency International UK confirmed the existence of 150 luxury properties in Britain whose Russian owners either have close connections with President Putin or who have been involved in previous scandals. Now, 2/3 of these are owned by overseas companies using nebulous shell companies or offshore trusts. This makes sanctioning individuals far more challenging, don't you think so?
Well, it's an interesting question. So the way that the whole sanctions program works is the government names the names of people who are sanctioned. So they go into a sanctions list. And the moment they go into the sanctions list, then a notification is sent out to every financial institution in the UK. And that notification is that it would be illegal to transact business with this person anymore. You can't send money, you can't receive money, you can't do anything. And so it's the responsibility of the financial institution to know who their client is, to know who the beneficial owners are, even if they're shell companies. So on one hand, yes, all this shell company stuff makes it harder for journalists and people like myself to look in and expose oligarchs. But on the other hand, if these people are genuinely put on the sanctions list, then there's a whole sort of foot soldier army of financial institutions whose duty is their legal duty and their where they can get into trouble if they don't fulfill this duty is to freeze the money. And so I'm not so worried about them not or about them sort of laughing off the threat of sanctions. If their names are put on the sanctions list, it will have a very detrimental effect. And maybe you're right about some assets not being identified, but for the most part, I think that if these people were sanctioned, it would be a really harsh punishment.
Now, going back to the UK's role, I mean, if Britain was willing to ignore the provenance of Russian dirty money for nearly 3 decades, why is it today spearheading a campaign to arm Ukraine's military?
Well, I think that there's a lot of different reasons, both political, moral, and practical. I mean, putting everything else aside, if Russia invades Ukraine, it's going to create a whole tidal wave of refugees, which will cause even more problems with immigration that's been plaguing Europe after Syria. But on top of that, this is the first moment since the UK has left the European Union that they have an opportunity to exercise an independent foreign policy.
Global Britain.
And this is a way in which Britain can behave in a true leadership way, and they are. And if you look at if you were just to do a tally by country of who's being most effective on Ukraine, I would argue it's the UK right now. They've provided a large number of very practical weapons, anti-tank weapons that can be used by soldiers. They can learn how to use them within an hour to fight off Russian tanks if they were to come in. Britain has made a 1.9 billion pound loan for military equipment. Britain has sent in soldiers to do training. And Britain is now talking about sanctioning Russian oligarchs. And so I'd say that on the world stage, Britain is doing a pretty good job right now, and particularly in comparison with countries like Germany and others that are almost trying to work cross purposes.
Right. Now, the Russian economy is very much dependent on revenues coming from oil and gas. Is it possible to sanction Russia by cutting down on gas imports? And would the EU be able to switch to alternative sources, say Qatari or Azerbaijani gas, in such a scenario?
Well, the Russia, this is not the first time that Russia has threatened gas as a geopolitical weapon. They started doing this 15 years ago. And so the practical response to that should have been in the European Union to do exactly that, to say we need to diversify, we need to get our gas from Azerbaijan or from Qatar or from the United States or from wherever. And they didn't do that. And so this is not something you can do on the flip of a switch. This is a long-term strategic decision that requires building infrastructure and changing entire patterns of trade flows. And so if Russia wanted to cut off the gas, they could basically make Germany a very cold country for the next few weeks, and places like Austria and Italy even colder. Germany has 40% of German gas comes from Russia. 100% of Austrian and Italian gas come from Russia.
Right, but the EU, instead of diversifying its energy sources, they in fact became far more dependent on Russia over the last 10 years. I mean,
yeah, it's a shocking betrayal of the national security interests of European citizens that Germany and other countries have done that.
Former German Chancellor Gerhard Schröder has been apparently receiving up to 850,000 euros a year from Russia, and he sits upon the governing board of Gazprom and Nord Stream 2. What have former officials such as Mr. Schröder come to symbolize in their relations with Russia?
Well, it just shows that how easy it is for Russians to effectively buy Western influence. And this, an $850,000 or euros sounds like a lot of money to regular people, but for the Russians, that's like the kind of change, spare change that's rattling around on the floor of their car. That's like a nothing amount of money to give Gerhard Schroeder. And what they get in return is he was the former chancellor of Germany. He was a very prominent member of the Social Democratic Party. And guess who's in power right now in Germany? The Social Democratic Party.
Right, right. So before we end, I mean, do you have any final advice to European governments and the United States in general? How should Putin be sanctioned? What is the most effective way?
Well, there's a very famous chess player, one of the chess champions of the world, Garry Kasparov. He was also a very prominent member of the Russian opposition. And he coined an amazing expression, which I think summarizes it all, which is that we don't have to fight them with tanks. We can fight them in the banks. And what I mean by that is we should go after their personal money. And if we were to do that, and if we would do it properly, not just broad sanctions or sanctions against the wrong people, but sanctions against the richest Russian oligarchs looking after Vladimir Putin's money, there would be no war in Ukraine.
Right. Mr. Browder, it was a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much once again for your time.
Thank you.